Today we're going to talk about BYU's wide receiving core. And think about this wide receiving position for BYU is on paper, it looks fairly deep. There are a number of bodies on this roster that BYU has put out, and they go from, I think, as a very clear top three of returning top talents for BYU. Of course, I'm speaking of the trio of Keanu Hill, Chase Roberts, and Kody Epps, who I think are going to be BYU's leading three receivers this year, barring one of them getting injured or the like. Now, the other question is, are the two transfers that have now come in via the transfer portal, speaking of Darius Lassiter as well as Keelan Marion, how will they slot in? Are they going to be part of the rotation right away? Will they start for BYU? That's another question to be asked about this position group. And then beyond that, do they have a 6th, 7th, 8th guy that they can count on if and when injuries will take their toll this season? No matter if they're season ending or a week-to-week deal, there are going to be injuries that BYU is going to have to absorb and obviously deal with. Do they have the guys there to solve all of that? So let's start off with what I think is the top question for BYU's wide receiving core is who is going to be the quote-unquote alpha of this group? Who is going to be the guy that BYU is going to target? As I mentioned, I think there is a very clear top three for BYU of returning starters in Chase Roberts, Keanu Hill, and Kody Epps. Now, a number of you out there probably are going to think that Kody Epps is the guy who you expect to be the number one wide receiver, number one option for BYU. I'm actually going in a different direction, and that is I think that Keanu Hill has been overlooked so many times in his BYU career. He is no longer supposed to be overlooked, I think. I think this is a guy who is poised to really break out and make the wide receiver position at BYU his own. He has got all the talent. He has got body size that I think that any of these other wide receivers on BYU's roster would love to have at 6'4", 215 pounds. You cannot teach that. He's got the bloodlines. His father, Lloyd Hill, was an All-American at Texas Tech. Obviously, BYU will be taking on Tech in October, and that'll be the homecoming game for BYU. And he's already said, we talked to him during spring ball, he told his dad, you can't come to that game and wear Texas Tech gear. But the fun part about this is a kid who in all these conversations just continually gets overlooked, and he was BYU's leading receiver last year in many categories. That's the thing about this with Keanu Hill. I think this is going to be the year he really establishes himself as the quote-unquote guy for BYU at wide receiver. Now, that's not to say that Kody Epps and Chase Roberts aren't capable of contributing. Epps is a fantastic slot-type wide receiver, 5'11", 187 pounds. You'll hear from him here in just a moment. I had a great chance to catch up with him at Big 12 Media Days. And then Chase Roberts, a similar body size to Keanu Hill, but plays a little bit differently at 6'4", 210 pounds. You can't teach what these guys have skills-wise, but I think that Keanu Hill is kind of the overlooked key cog in all of this for BYU. And now when I say being the alpha, being the guy for BYU, I'm not saying that Keanu Hill's going to go out, notch 1,500 yards like Austin Collie, and everybody else is going to be picking up scraps on the side. That's not what I'm expecting. I'm just expecting, in my mind, that Keanu Hill has got all the ability if he is required. Like I say, it's a critical down and distance. You need a 3rd and 6, and you know you're going to be throwing the ball. Kedon Slovis drops back. He's looking for his guy. Who's he look to? I think some of you might think he looks to Kody Epps, and he probably will, but I'm telling you, Keanu Hill has proven time and time again that he can be a difference maker for BYU wide receiver. Now, the other thing that he has over the other two is that Keanu Hill has been on the field far more in his BYU career than Kody Epps and Chase Roberts. Both of them have dealt with injuries, 3 season-ending injuries in 3 straight years for Kody Epps. There's no other way around describing that. Chase Roberts had hip issues that have resolved before he finally saw the field, and even then, last season, he had some other injuries that precluded him from playing in all the games. Keanu Hill, the best ability is availability, and that's what Keanu Hill offers. Now, those top 3, I think, will be BYU's main guys when it comes to the passing game. But they do have 2 transfers that have come in. Darius Lassiter, who will wear the number 5 for BYU, and Keelan Marion, who's going to wear the number 17. Both of them have had their moments in their college careers to this point. Darius Lassiter had a fantastic bowl game for Eastern Michigan in the famous Idaho Potato Bowl. Can he channel more of that and making that the more consistent version of himself with BYU? We'll have to wait and see. Keelan Marion has dealt with so many quarterbacks throwing the ball at UConn. It's actually a miracle he's had any type of production in many ways. He's just had so many people at quarterback for UConn during his time there, but he has proven that no matter who's been slinging him the rock, he's been able to be productive with it. He's obviously dealt with injuries in his own right during his career, but I think both of them factor in immediately as rotation pieces for BYU. I think those 5 players I've already listed probably are going to be your top 5 guys for BYU, barring one of them getting injured. But 5 wide receivers is not enough. BYU knows knows this. They've tried to get that quote-unquote quality depth into their football program, and that's something that's going to be very critical for them this year. That's where guys like a Parker Kingston come into the mix. Now, the guys I've already mentioned, we have Kody Epps at 5'11", Keanu Hill and Chase Roberts at 6'4", Lassiter at 6'3", and Keelan Marion at 6 foot. So you got some good size at wide receiver, but Kody Epps is kind of the one outlier being under 6 feet tall for BYU and playing that slot position. That's where I think a guy like Parker Kingston comes into the mix. At 6 foot, 180 pounds. I have it on very good authority that in pads, he was BYU's fastest player on the football field during spring camp. Should not come as any surprise considering this kid, when he was at Roy High School, was in the 100-meter finals his senior year in the Utah High School track and field championships. This is a kid who can absolutely fly. The nice part is Parker was having a very, very good spring camp before breaking his hand. He is fully healed, and he should be available day one of training camp. And I think he factors in probably the number 6 spot right away for BYU. So in theory, you have, I think, 6 very, very good options at wide receiver for BYU, but that does not even include the likes of like a Hobbs Nyberg, a Devin Downing, a Dom Henry, who was the breakout star of spring camp, Cade Moore, there are Talmadge Gunther. Geez, I look at this list, Koa Eldridge. They have all been able to show what they're capable of doing during spring camp, but training camp and actual game reps that will be coming up this season are going to be critical for these guys to establish themselves in the pecking order. They obviously need to go out and show what they're capable of and earn their coach's trust during training camp, and then if they're given opportunities in game, don't muff it. Don't screw it up, because that might be your one and only chance to impress a guy like Fesi Sitake. Fesi Sitake, is BYU's wide receivers coach, is very exacting. He wants guys doing things the right way. BYU's wide receiver production over the last few years has seen an uptick, and a lot of it goes to, I think, the coaching of a guy like Fesi Sitake. He is a perfectionist when it comes to making sure his wide receivers know exactly what they're needing to do, how to do it, and obviously expecting them to go out and perform to the level of their capability. So I like the names on this list. I really do. I think top to bottom, you've got a nice core of wide receivers. You also bring in some freshmen who I think have a lot of promise down the road. JoJo Phillips was a very celebrated recruit for BYU coming in. He's 6'5". He's the tallest of all the wide receivers on BYU's roster. 6'5", 190 pounds. Former basketball player at Sierra Canyon High School, rubbing shoulders with the likes of Bronny, LeBron James Jr., down there at Sierra Canyon. He has got all the ability, it looks like, just looking at his high school tape, of being a future star for BYU. He's going to be joined by Kevin Doe, a walk-on from East High School, who I think has shown some nice things during his high school days, as well as Jake Hill, a returned missionary, coming back off of a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And similar to Parker Kingston, Jake Hill is an absolute speedster, but has more size than a guy like Kingston at 6'3", 190 pounds. Hill was a native of St. George, Utah, and prepped at Snow Canyon High School. So I think you have a very, very established kind of different tiers of wide receivers for BYU. I think you've got an established, what I would consider to be at least a top 5, if not a top 6, which I expect, in my mind, to be the main rotation for BYU. Then I think you have what you call your middle class, where it's a mixture of guys who are young, guys who've been in the program for a year or two on scholarship, or are veteran walk-ons. I'm thinking of guys like Hobbs Nyberg in particular in that mix, a Cade Moore, who has stuck around the program for so long here. Other guys that are in that mix would include Dom Henry, like I said, who is a spring camp superstar. We'll see if he can translate that to training camp and games this fall. And then I think you have the incoming freshmen, who I think you'll probably be looking at them making an impact maybe on special teams, getting some time later on in the year without burning their red shirts, playing in those 4 games they can be allotted while keeping that red shirt intact. So I'm very intrigued with the wide receiver position. Like I said, I want to see one of these guys move out and really establish themselves as the lead guy, like a Puka Nacua was a year ago, or guys like not Chase Roberts, Cody Hoffman back in his heyday, Austin Collie. The greatest wide receivers in BYU history, Margin Hooks, on down the list. You can think back. They were guys who were able to establish themselves as the guy and went out and produced like that as well. My money's on Keanu Hill coming seemingly, quote-unquote, out of nowhere for some of you, I think, to do that. But don't be surprised if Kody Epps has that opportunity, Chase Roberts has got the ability to do that, or maybe one of these transfers, and both Darius Lassiter and Keelan Marion really just seize the opportunity by the horns and really establish themselves. They do need to find a go-to guy at this position, and my money's on Keanu Hill right now. Could I be wrong about that? Absolutely. I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again, but I've got my money on Keanu Hill. I'd love to see who who you guys would project? Do you think it's Kody Epps? Do you think one of these transfers has the ability? Do you think one of the other guys on this roster at wide receiver have the chops to come out and really make a strong impression? Could Dom Henry, all that stuff we saw during spring ball with him showing out and making these big catches seemingly every time we were out there as a media corps, does that actually translatable to the football field? If that is, he could find himself supplanting somebody potentially in the pecking order, maybe making that rotation 7 or 8 guys deep. That's the thing about this is I think there's a nice rotation cast available for BYU, and in particular a guy like Kedon Slovis to throw the rock to, but you need to have that guy or maybe 1 or 2 guys that when it's a critical down and distance, like I said, 3rd and 6, you got to convert, you're down 3, you're trying to get yourself in field goal range. You guys get the scenarios I'm kind of describing here. You need to have 1 or 2 of those guys that hey, this is the route I need you to run. I need you to get it to the 6. I need you to get me a first down. And even if it's great coverage, they still find a way to get themselves an opening where you can fire it in there if you're Kedon Slovis and convert and move the chains. You need to have some of those guys establish themselves, and we'll see. It's going to be a very, very fun training camp with these wide receivers because I think there's a lot of talent top to bottom in this group. The question for me will be, okay, I think I have what in my mind is 6 guys who I think are the established rotation going into training camp in my mind. Can somebody else or some people else, I'm trying to say that correctly, some other bodies, I guess I should say, can they go out and make a big enough impression that they force their way into the conversation for that rotation? And we all know that iron sharpens iron. It's the old adage that's used all the time by coaches in football. Well, this is going to be a wide receiving core that's absolutely going to be tried and tested, and they all will have to establish themselves in that pecking order, that depth chart very early on in training camp, and obviously prove it out on the field against Sam Houston State and on down the list as BYU begins play in the Big 12 Conference.